Ethan never expected to wake up to the sight of a middle-aged woman standing in his backyard, clipboard in hand, as if she were conducting a military inspection. It was 7:30 in the morning, the sun had barely risen, and there she was, examining his fence with the intensity of a forensic scientist at a crime scene. Ethan rubbed his eyes, convinced he was still half dreaming. But no, there she was, squinting at the wood panels and muttering to herself like she was solving the mystery of the century. His coffee wasn't even brewed yet, and already the day had taken a bizarre turn. He stormed outside barefoot, his t-shirt barely covering his confusion. "Excuse me, what exactly are you doing?" he asked, his voice still groggy from sleep. The woman, without flinching, turned to face him, her eyes filled with self-importance. "Good morning, I'm Mrs. Henderson, head of the HOA committee," she announced, as if he should be honored by her presence. "I'm just doing a routine inspection. This fence, well, it's not quite up to neighborhood standards." Ethan blinked, trying to process the absurdity of what he was hearing. He took a slow look at his fence, solid, sturdy, completely fine. "I'm not even part of the HOA," he said, crossing his arms. Mrs. Henderson's face twitched ever so slightly, but she didn't back down. "Your property is adjacent to HOA land, which means your aesthetic choices impact the overall value of our community. We like to maintain a uniform look." Ethan exhaled sharply. "So what exactly is wrong with my fence?" She tilted her head, pretending to analyze the structure like an art critic. "For one, the color is a little off. It should be a deep brown, not this faded shade of tan. And it's exactly 1.5 inches taller than it should be. Did you get HOA approval before you built it?" Ethan let out a laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Why would I need HOA approval when I'm not in the HOA?" Mrs. Henderson gave him a sympathetic yet patronizing smile, the kind one might offer a child who just asked if clouds are made of cotton candy. "Oh, Ethan," she said, as if they were old friends. "You may not be an official member, but as part of the neighborhood, it's important to be cooperative." Ethan was still groggy, but now he was also angry. "Cooperative? You're trespassing on my property at the crack of dawn to measure my fence with your little clipboard. That doesn't sound like cooperation, that sounds like harassment." Mrs. Henderson gasped, as if he had just insulted her entire bloodline. "I am only trying to keep the neighborhood looking presentable. There's no need for hostility. But if you insist on being difficult, I'm afraid I'll have to report this to the committee." Ethan couldn't help but laugh again. "Go ahead, report it to whoever you want. Just stay off my property." She gave him a tight smile and walked away, but not before taking one last dramatic look at his fence, as if it personally offended her. Ethan thought that would be the end of it. He was wrong. Over the next week, Mrs. Henderson made it her personal mission to monitor his yard, as if she were a park ranger protecting an endangered species. He caught glimpses of her peering through his bushes, pacing along the property line, and even setting up what looked suspiciously like a camera disguised as a bird feeder. Then came the official notice. A crisp white envelope was left in his mailbox, adorned with the HOA logo. Inside was a formal letter stating that his fence violated neighborhood regulations, along with a demand for immediate modification. The letter was signed by Mrs. Henderson herself, along with an ominous warning that failure to comply could result in further actions. Ethan was baffled. He wasn't part of the HOA, and yet here they were, treating him like he had broken some sacred law. He decided to ignore it. That was a mistake. A few days later, he came home to find Mrs. Henderson standing in his yard again, this time with a tape measure, diligently measuring his grass length. Ethan's patience snapped. "That's it. Get out of my yard." Mrs. Henderson barely looked up. "Did you know your grass is precisely 1/2 inch taller than the HOA guidelines allow?" she said, as if that was a crime worthy of exile. Ethan took a deep breath, rubbing his temples. "I don't care about the HOA guidelines. I am not in the HOA." She pursed her lips. "That's unfortunate, Ethan, because I'm afraid the committee has already voted. If you don't comply, we'll be forced to take legal action." Ethan stared at her, stunned. "Legal action? Over my grass?" Mrs. Henderson nodded. "And the fence? And the overall atmosphere of your property? It's simply not in line with the community's aesthetic." Ethan had had enough. It was clear that logic wouldn't work on this woman. If she wanted to play games, he was going to play right back. But he wasn't going to argue. He wasn't going to reason. He was going to give her exactly what she deserved. That night, Ethan got to work. He printed a large, bold sign and hammered it into the ground right by the fence. It read, in all caps, "Beware of lion." The next morning, Mrs. Henderson returned, clipboard in hand, ready to issue another complaint. But the moment she saw the sign, she froze. Her eyes widened, and for the first time, Ethan saw something on her face that he hadn't seen before: doubt. She took a step back, glancing around as if expecting a wild animal to leap out from the bushes. "Ethan, what is this?" Ethan sipped his coffee and shrugged. "Oh, just a friendly warning." Mrs. Henderson swallowed hard, looking at the sign, then at Ethan. You don't actually have a lion, do you?" Ethan didn't answer. He simply let the silence stretch, watching as Mrs. Henderson's paranoia took hold. Finally, she turned on her heel and hurried away. Ethan smirked. This was going to be fun. Word of the lion sign spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Ethan had barely finished his morning coffee when he saw his next-door neighbor, Mr. Peterson, peering over the fence with a look of sheer terror. "Ethan, buddy, just checking in," he said, forcing a nervous chuckle. "Saw your sign. Didn't hear anything about a new pet?" Ethan, still enjoying the chaos he had created, took a slow sip of his coffee and gave a nonchalant shrug. "You know how it is, Peterson. Got to keep the place secure." Mr. Peterson gulped and backed away, muttering something about checking his home insurance policy. Ethan didn't confirm or deny anything, and that was the best part. Let them wonder. Let them imagine. By the afternoon, the neighborhood was in full-blown speculation mode. 2 doors down, an elderly woman whispered to her friend about the wild beast lurking behind Ethan's fence. A group of kids rode their bikes extra fast past his property, eyes wide with curiosity and fear. Even the mailman hesitated before slipping letters into the mailbox, as if expecting a paw to swipe out and snatch him. Ethan couldn't have asked for a better result. But the real masterpiece came when Mrs. Henderson returned. She showed up at precisely 2 p.m., clipboard in hand, as expected. But this time, her usually smug expression was replaced with unease. She stood at the edge of the yard, fidgeting slightly, her eyes darting toward the bushes. Ethan watched from his porch, amused. "Something wrong, Mrs. Henderson." She cleared her throat, forcing herself to look composed. "I've received multiple complaints from concerned residents. There are rumors that you haven't," she hesitated, as if saying it out loud would summon a lion from thin air. "That you have a wild animal on your property." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "A wild animal? Now that's an interesting rumor." Mrs. Henderson narrowed her eyes. "You know exactly what I'm talking about, Ethan. This is serious. If you actually have an exotic animal, it would be in violation of countless zoning laws and safety regulations, not to mention the HOA guidelines on proper pet ownership." Ethan took another sip of his coffee and let the silence drag just long enough to make her shift uncomfortably. "Well, that's the thing, isn't it? I'm not in the HOA. So even if I did have something, let's say, unique, it wouldn't really be any of your concern, would it?" Mrs. Henderson's lips pressed into a thin line. "Ethan, don't play games. If this is some kind of joke, it's gone far enough. You need to take that sign down immediately." Ethan tilted his head, pretending to consider it. "But what if I actually do have a lion? Wouldn't want to mislead people now, would I?" That did it. Mrs. Henderson's face paled ever so slightly. For the first time since their ridiculous feud began, she didn't have a quick-witted response. Instead, she took a small step back, glancing at the bushes as if expecting a pair of glowing eyes to emerge. Ethan held back a grin. "Of course, you're welcome to come in and take a look for yourself," he added. Mrs. Henderson's jaw tightened. She hesitated, then, in the most uncharacteristic move Ethan had ever seen, she stepped backward again. "That won't be necessary," she said stiffly. "But I will be reporting this to the committee. Expect an official notice soon." Ethan watched her hurry away, her usual arrogance dimmed by something new, genuine uncertainty. That evening, Ethan took things a step further. He installed a small Bluetooth speaker near the fence, tucked neatly behind the bushes. With a little effort, he found an app that played realistic animal sounds, including deep, guttural growls. It was a small touch, but an effective one. The next morning, Mrs. Henderson returned with backup. This time, she had 3 other HOA members in tow, 2 men in polo shirts and a woman clutching a folder like it was a sacred text. They stood by the fence, whispering among themselves, before Mrs. Henderson stepped forward. "Ethan," she called, her voice trying to sound authoritative but cracking slightly. "We need full access to your yard for an inspection." Immediately, Ethan leaned against the porch railing. "Now, why would I allow that?" One of the men, who Ethan recognized as Mr. Grayson, puffed out his chest. "We have reason to believe you are harboring a dangerous animal." Ethan gave a slow, amused nod. "So let me get this straight. You, a group of HOA board members, think I have a lion, and your grand plan is to walk into my yard unarmed and demand to see it? That's your strategy." The woman with the folder looked suddenly unsure. She shifted slightly, glancing at Mrs. Henderson. "Well, when you put it like that." Mrs. Henderson shot her a glare before turning back to Ethan. "Enough of this nonsense. Either you allow us access, or we escalate this matter legally." Ethan sighed dramatically. "Fine, go ahead. But don't say I didn't warn you." He pulled out his phone and, with a tap, activated the speaker. A deep, reverberating growl filled the air, low and menacing, like something massive was lurking just beyond the fence. The reaction was immediate. The woman with the folder let out a tiny shriek and took a full step back. One of the men muttered a curse under his breath. Even Mrs. Henderson, despite her bravado, visibly tensed. Then Ethan cranked the volume higher. A second, longer growl rumbled through the yard. Mr. Grayson turned on his heel and walked away without another word. The woman followed. The second man hesitated for half a second before rushing after them. Mrs. Henderson, however, stayed. She looked furious, but for the first time, there was something else mixed into her expression. Was it fear? "You are going to regret this," she hissed. "You think this is funny? You think this is a game?" Ethan shrugged. "A little." She clenched her fists and stormed off. Ethan grinned. That night, he sat on his porch, watching as neighborhood lights flickered on one by one. People were talking. The rumor mill was churning at full speed. He overheard hushed conversations, words like dangerous, illegal, and lion being thrown around. Someone even suggested calling animal control. Perfect. Ethan leaned back in his chair, taking a long sip of his drink. Mrs. Henderson wanted a battle. He was more than happy to give her one. By the next morning, Ethan knew he had won the first round. The neighborhood was buzzing with paranoia. People were too afraid to even walk their dogs near his yard. One guy even started jogging on the opposite side of the street, glancing nervously toward Ethan's property like a hungry lion might leap over the fence at any second. It was the best entertainment Ethan had had in years. But he also knew Mrs. Henderson wouldn't give up that easily. She wasn't the kind of person who let things slide. Sure enough, before noon, a white van rolled up to his house, and out stepped 2 uniformed officers from animal control. Ethan sat back in his chair, sipping his coffee, watching as they approached with a mix of determination and discomfort. One of them, a tall, lanky guy with a notepad, cleared his throat. "Sir, we've received a report about an exotic animal being housed on your property. Specifically, a lion." Ethan took another slow sip of his coffee, letting the silence stretch. "A lion, huh?" he finally said. "That's a serious accusation." The second officer, a woman with short blonde hair, gave him a skeptical look. "Do you have an exotic animal in your backyard, sir?" Ethan sighed, standing up. "Well, I'd hate for you to waste your time. You're welcome to take a look." The officers exchanged glances, clearly expecting some kind of elaborate cover-up. Ethan led them to the backyard, stepping aside so they could get a full view. He watched as their eyes scanned every inch, taking in the perfectly normal, completely lion-free yard. The only living creature back there was his fat orange cat, Mr. Whiskers, who was currently sprawled out in a patch of sunlight, looking utterly unimpressed with the whole situation. The lanky officer blinked. Sir, this appears to be a regular house cat." Ethan nodded solemnly. "Yep." The blonde officer frowned. "Then what's with the sign?" Ethan shrugged. "Security measure. You'd be surprised how effective it's been." The 2 officers exchanged another glance. They clearly knew they had been sent on a wild goose chase, but they also couldn't exactly arrest him for putting up a fake sign. The blonde officer sighed and pulled out a form. "All right, sir. Since there's no actual exotic animal here, there's no violation. But we do need to document that this was a false report." Ethan grinned. "Oh, I'd love that. I bet I can even tell you who made the report." The officers, now visibly annoyed, didn't argue. They handed him a copy of the report and left, shaking their heads. Ethan watched them drive off before turning toward Mrs. Henderson's house across the street. Sure enough, she was standing at her window, peering through the blinds, her expression a mix of frustration and disbelief. Ethan held up the paper and waved. Later that afternoon, Ethan decided to do some research. If Mrs. Henderson wanted to drag him into HOA nonsense, he figured it was only fair that he dug into her history as well. A few clicks on the county website led him to some interesting discoveries. It turned out the HOA had been collecting fines from non-HOA residents under the pretense of neighborhood compliance. The same bogus charges Mrs. Henderson had tried to slap on him had been used on others before. Some people had even paid them, assuming they were legitimate. Ethan didn't just sit on this information. He printed out copies, attached them to a strongly worded letter, and sent them directly to the county office, the local news, and every single homeowner who had ever received one of those fake fines. He also may have slipped an extra copy under Mrs. Henderson's door, just for good measure. It didn't take long for the fallout to begin. By the next week, an official investigation was launched into the HOA's finances. A few of the committee members started jumping ship, claiming they had no idea Mrs. Henderson had been misusing funds. The neighborhood was in an uproar. People who had previously been terrified of the HOA were suddenly demanding answers. Mrs. Henderson, of course, tried to do damage control. She called for an emergency HOA meeting, insisting it was all a misunderstanding. But when she showed up, she was met with a mob of angry residents who had finally had enough. Someone even had a printout of Ethan's fake fine, waving it in the air as they shouted about fraud. Ethan, of course, attended the meeting with a big bucket of popcorn. As things spiraled out of control, Mrs. Henderson tried one last desperate move. She stood at the front of the room, hands raised, voice shaking with forced authority. "Everyone, please, let's remain calm. This is a simple case of miscommunication. I have only ever had the best interests of this neighborhood at heart." Ethan took that as his cue. He stood up, holding the copy of the animal control report. "Oh yeah? Then what's this? A false report made to authorities because you didn't like my yard." The room turned silent. All eyes shifted to Mrs. Henderson, who suddenly looked a lot less sure of herself. Someone in the crowd muttered, "She wasted city resources." Another person said, "Wait, she did what?" Ethan smirked. "You know, I hear filing false complaints is actually a serious offense. Maybe I should report that too." Mrs. Henderson stammered for a response, but she had nothing. The walls were closing in, and she knew it. By the end of the meeting, it was official. Mrs. Henderson was being removed from her position. The HOA was collapsing under the weight of its own corruption. Refunds were being issued to those who had been scammed, and the neighborhood suddenly found itself free from the iron grip of its former dictator. Ethan celebrated in the only way that felt right. The next morning, he put up a new sign in his yard. This one read, in big bold letters, "Beware of karma." Mrs. Henderson moved out within the month. The house sat empty for a long time, as if the neighborhood itself was trying to recover from her reign. Ethan, on the other hand, finally got to enjoy his home in peace. No more bogus fines. No more unwanted inspections. No more nonsense. And best of all, his lion sign still stood proudly by the fence. Because, in the end, it had done exactly what it was supposed to do. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.